You probably have a memory of a grandparent doing something small, handing you food, telling you a story, sitting nearby while you played. It felt like love. It felt like warmth. But what you were actually experiencing was one of the most powerful survival mechanisms in the entire history of your species. Because grandparents did not always exist, not the way you think. And the fact that they do, the fact that humans live long past their ability to reproduce, is one of the strangest and most consequential accidents in evolutionary history. Most animals do not get old. They reproduce, they decline, and they die. A female chimpanzee, your closest living relative, reaches the end of her reproductive years and dies not long after. Her body has no reason to keep running. Evolution has no use for her, but your grandmother lived to 73, or 81, or 94. And that gap between when a human woman stops having children and when she actually dies is called the grandmother window, and it may have changed everything. This is not a sentimental idea. It is a hard evolutionary argument, and it starts with a simple question. Why do humans live so long after they stop reproducing? In most species, natural selection stops caring about you the moment you can no longer pass on your genes. You are, from evolution's perspective, finished, dead weight, but humans break that rule. Women live 30, 40, sometimes 50 years past menopause. That does not happen by accident. Something about having grandmothers, specifically grandmothers, must have helped children survive. Otherwise, that long post-reproductive life would have been eliminated from the gene pool long ago. The researcher who formalized this idea was Kristen, an anthropologist at the University of Utah. In the 1980s, Hawkes spent time with the Hadza people in Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies on Earth. She went there to study men. She expected to find that big-game hunters, men who brought back large kills, were the ones feeding children and driving survival. What she found instead stopped her cold. The men were mostly failing. They spent days hunting large animals and came back empty-handed more often than not. Meanwhile, older women, grandmothers, post-reproductive women with no infants of their own, were out every day digging tubers, gathering berries, collecting the hard, buried, difficult-to-process foods that young mothers with babies on their hips could not reach. And those grandmothers were bringing back more food than anyone else. They were feeding their grandchildren directly, and the grandchildren with living grandmothers were surviving at significantly higher rates than the ones without. Hawkes called this the grandmother hypothesis, and it rewrote the conversation about human longevity. Here is what it means. When your ancient ancestor's mother stopped having her own babies, she did not stop being useful. She redirected all of her energy, her foraging skill, her strength, her knowledge, her time, toward her grandchildren. She freed up her own daughter to have another baby sooner. She fed the children her daughter could not feed alone. She increased the survival odds of every child in that family, and in doing so, she passed on her genes, not directly, but through the children and grandchildren who carried half of them. Evolution rewarded long post-reproductive life, because long post-reproductive life saved children. But grandmothers were not only food providers, they were something else, something that modern neuroscience is only beginning to understand. They were memory banks. Think about what knowledge meant in a world with no writing, no books, no internet. No way to record anything except the human brain. In that world, older people were not just family members. They were libraries. They were the only living record of what had happened before. And in environments where survival depended on knowing things, which plants are poisonous in a drought year, where the water goes when the river dries up, what the last famine looked like, and how long it lasted, an old person with that knowledge was worth more than almost anything else. Researcher James Woodburn, who also studied the Hadza, documented that elder members of hunter-gatherer groups held exclusive knowledge of water sources, seasonal food patterns, and emergency survival strategies that younger members simply did not have. In lean years, that knowledge was the difference between life and death. The grandmother who had survived 3 droughts knew things no young adult could know, and she passed that knowledge on through story, through demonstration, through the daily act of teaching grandchildren how the world actually worked. This is why your brain responds the way it does to grandparent figures. That pull toward an older person, that sense of safety and wisdom in their presence, that is not nostalgia, that is an ancient signal. Your nervous system was shaped over hundreds of thousands of years to recognize the value of that person, to lean toward them, to absorb what they knew. There is a third thing ancient grandparents did that almost no one talks about. They babysat. This sounds trivial. It is not. Human infants are uniquely helpless. your baby is born with an enormous brain that is only about 25% developed at birth. That brain takes years to reach functional maturity, which means a human child requires constant supervision, constant feeding, constant protection for an extraordinarily long time compared to any other primate. A chimpanzee mother can manage this largely alone. A human mother could not and survive. Not and have additional children, not and gather enough food to keep everyone alive. But if there is a grandmother nearby, someone past reproductive age with no infant of her own, with decades of childcare experience, with deep knowledge of what children need and what dangers they face, the entire burden shifts. The mother can range farther, can gather more food, can have her next child sooner, can sleep. Researchers Kim Sterelny and Paul Griffiths have argued that alloparenting, the practice of non-parents caring for children, was not just helpful in human evolution, it was structurally necessary. Humans may have only been able to become humans because multiple adults were caring for each child at once, and grandmother was usually the most important of those adults. Consider what you are for a moment. You have a brain that is 3 times larger than it should be for a primate your size. You live in dense social groups. You communicate in abstract language. You teach things that are not immediately useful, stories, values, histories, because you understand that future situations will require them. None of those things are free. They are all enormously expensive in evolutionary terms, and they may all have been made possible by the grandmother effect. By the simple fact that older women, freed from reproduction, poured their remaining decades into the survival and development of the next generation. Rachel Caspari, a paleoanthropologist at Central Michigan University, analyzed fossilized teeth from human ancestors across a span of 3 million years. She was looking for signs of longevity, specifically, evidence of individuals who had lived long enough to become grandparents. What she found was a dramatic spike. Around 30,000 years ago, the ratio of older to younger adults in the fossil record increased by more than 300%. It was, she argued, a longevity revolution, and it coincided almost exactly with the explosion of art, symbolic thinking, complex tools, and cultural sophistication that archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic transition, the moment when humans became, in every meaningful sense, modern. Caspari's argument is striking. The moment humans started living long enough to become grandparents in large numbers, something cracked open in the species. Knowledge could accumulate. Stories could pass between 3 living generations at once. A child could know their great-grandmother's experience. And that chain of living memory, that multi-generational transfer of everything a culture had learned, may have been the spark that lit the fire of human civilization. Now here is the part that nobody expected. It was not just grandmothers. For a long time, the grandmother hypothesis focused almost entirely on women. The data pointed there. The foraging patterns pointed there. But more recent research has started asking a harder question. What were grandfathers doing? The answer is stranger than you might think. And it reveals something uncomfortable about what men were actually built for. Grandfathers, it turns out, were not primarily providers of food, not in the direct, daily way grandmothers were. Their role was something older, something that operated at the level of the entire group rather than the individual family. Anthropologist David Putz at Penn State University has studied male aging across cultures and found that older men in traditional societies occupied a specific and irreplaceable social function. They were referees, arbiters, the people who remembered how disputes had been settled before, who had seen what happened the last time 2 families stopped sharing resources, who understood from lived experience that cooperation was the only thing standing between the group and collapse. In a world without courts, without police, without any formal institution of justice, the memory of an elder male was the closest thing a community had to law, not because he was physically dominant, he was not anymore, but because everyone else in the group had watched him navigate conflict for 40 years, because he had earned, through sheer survival, a kind of credibility that no young man could fake. His word carried weight not because of his muscles, because of his years. This division makes a strange kind of sense when you look at it from the outside. Grandmothers fed children and carried embodied ecological knowledge, which plants, which seasons, which roots. Grandfathers managed social knowledge, which people, which alliances, which threats. Together, they formed something like a complete operating system for the group, one tracking the relationship between humans and the natural world, the other tracking the relationships between humans and each other. And children absorbed both, not in classrooms, not through lectures, through the slow, daily accumulation of proximity. Through watching, through listening to stories at night, through the 10,000 small interactions that never felt like education but were. This is something that developmental psychologist Susan Engel at Williams College has documented in modern children. Children do not learn primarily through formal instruction. They learn through observation. Through narrative, through watching trusted adults navigate real situations and internalizing the patterns. Your ancient ancestors knew this without knowing it. They built their entire knowledge transmission system around it. Put a child near an elder long enough, and the elder's world becomes the child's world. The elder's map of reality gets copied, imperfectly but permanently, into the child's developing brain. That is what a grandparent was, a living curriculum, a walking archive of everything the group had figured out about surviving in this particular place, in this particular world, at this particular moment in time. And then something happened that changed everything, again. About 10,000 years ago, humans invented agriculture. They stopped moving and started staying. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. For the first time in human history, you did not need an elder to remember where the water went in a drought. You could dig a well. You did not need a grandmother to know which tuber stored best through winter. You had a granary. For the first time, external storage, pots, silos, written records, eventually books, began to replace the internal storage that grandparents had always provided. And slowly, almost invisibly, the role of grandparents started to change. It did not disappear. The research is clear that grandparents continued to improve child survival rates well into the agricultural era and beyond. A 2004 study by Eckhart Voland and Janina Baez examining church records from 18th century Germany found that the presence of a maternal grandmother, specifically the mother's mother, significantly reduced child mortality in the first 2 years of life. Even in a world with farming, with villages, with stored food and established communities, the grandmother effect persisted. The mechanism had shifted from foraging to caregiving, but the outcome was the same. Grandmothers kept children alive. What changed was the social weight of elder knowledge. In a hunter-gatherer band, the elder's memory was irreplaceable. No one else had it. No document could substitute for the person who had been there. But in a literate civilization, knowledge could be written down and outlast the person who held it. The individual elder became less uniquely essential. Not useless, but no longer the sole container of critical information. And yet your brain did not get that memo. Your nervous system was not rewired when the Neolithic Revolution happened. The deep circuitry that makes you trust older people, that makes you feel safe near grandparent figures, that makes you lean in when an elder speaks, all of that was already ancient by the time your ancestors planted their first crop. It is still in you now. Operating quietly beneath every family dinner, every phone call to an aging parent, every moment you feel unexpectedly moved when someone very old tells you something they learned long ago. You are not being sentimental, you are being human. Exactly as human as your ancestors were, sitting around a fire 300,000 years ago, listening to the oldest person in the group describe a time before anyone else could remember. There is one more thing worth knowing, one more layer beneath all of this. The grandmother effect did not just help individual children survive, it changed the pace of human childhood itself. Humans have the longest childhood of any primate, by a wide margin. A chimpanzee is essentially independent by age 5. Your child is still legally a minor at 17. That extended childhood is not a design flaw. It is the system working exactly as intended. A longer childhood means more time for the brain to develop, more time to absorb language, social rules, ecological knowledge, cultural patterns, more time to learn before you have to act. But that long childhood has a cost. Someone has to support it. Someone has to feed and protect a child for 15 or more years before they can contribute anything to the group. In a world with scarce resources, that is an enormous investment. The only way it pays off is if what gets learned during those years is genuinely valuable, which it is, but also someone has to be available to make that investment, not just parents who have their own children arriving every few years, someone else, someone older. Someone whose reproductive window has closed and whose energy can go entirely into the next generation. Grandmother, again, always grandmother. Anthropologist Sarah Blaffer, HRDY, at the University of California, Davis, spent decades studying the evolution of human cooperation and childcare. Her conclusion was blunt: humans are not naturally selfless. But humans who grew up surrounded by cooperative kin, including grandmothers who invested heavily in their care, developed the neural architecture for empathy, for trust, for long-term thinking, at higher rates than children who did not. The grandmother was not just feeding the body. She was shaping the mind, building, generation by generation, the cognitive and emotional toolkit that would eventually allow humans to form cities, institutions, civilizations. Now consider what this means for the world you live in today. You live in a society that has quietly dismantled the conditions that made the grandmother effect possible. You live far from your parents, or your grandparents live in a separate house, a separate city, sometimes a separate country. Or they live in a care facility, surrounded by strangers, visited on holidays. The nuclear family replaced the extended family. The suburb replaced the village. And in doing so, something ancient and structurally important got quietly removed from the lives of children. This is not a moral argument. It is an evolutionary one. The system your species ran on for 3 million years assumed that multiple generations of kin would be physically present in a child's daily life. It assumed that a grandmother would be there in the morning and there at night. That a grandfather's voice would be a constant background presence. That the texture of elder experience would be woven into a child's developing understanding of the world. That assumption is now wrong for hundreds of millions of children, and researchers are beginning to document what that absence costs. A 2010 study by Margarita Baumeister and colleagues tracking child development in Chile found that children with regular access to grandparent care showed measurably better outcomes in social cognition and emotional regulation than children in institutional daycare. Not because grandparents are better than professional childcare workers at changing diapers or teaching letters, but because what grandparents provide is something no institution can replicate. They provide a living relationship with time, with continuity, with the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of who this child is and where they come from. A child who grows up knowing their grandmother's story, not an abstract family history, but the lived, told, emotionally present account of a real person's real life, develops something researchers call temporal self-extension, the ability to locate yourself in a larger narrative. To understand that you are not just a point in time, but a link in a chain, that what you do now will matter to someone you will never meet, that the people who came before you struggled and learned and built something that you are now standing on. That is not a small thing. That might be the most important thing. Because here is the truth that all of this research, across decades and disciplines and continents, keeps arriving at. The thing that made humans human was not the big brain alone, not language alone, not tools or fire or agriculture alone. It was the ability to take what one generation learned and hand it, intact, to the next, to compress a lifetime of hard-won knowledge into a story told by firelight, to look at a child and say, "Here is what I know. Here is what it cost me to learn it. Do not waste it." Every grandmother who ever sat with a grandchild and talked about anything, about nothing, about what the sky looked like when she was young, was performing that act. An act so old it predates our species' name. An act that built, brick by invisible brick, the civilization you were born into. You are, in some measurable sense, the product of grandmothers you will never know. Women who died before written history, who left no names, no graves, no artifacts, who are invisible to archaeology and invisible to memory, but who fed someone who fed someone who fed someone who eventually, across an unbroken chain of survival, became the person who became you. That old person in your life, the one who hands you things, tells you things, sits nearby while you exist, is doing something that goes back further than language, further than fire, further than anything your species would recognize as culture. They are doing what the oldest humans did when the world was still being figured out. They are keeping something alive that would otherwise disappear. They are passing on what it took a lifetime to know. And you, every time you sit beside them and listen, are doing exactly what your ancient ancestors did too. The first time you heard a grandparent's voice, it probably felt like warmth. It was, but it was also a survival mechanism 3 million years in the making.